As gun violence continues to plague communities across the Western Cape, there are calls for a specialised firearm investigation unit and saying that this is necessary. In the latest shooting, 3 people died at a house in Harare in Khayelitsha on Monday, while 2 were critically wounded. And this is the latest in a string of shootings that we've seen, really plaguing some of the townships in Cape Town. And of course, there have been calls for action in this particular regard. Let's speak now to Jeremy Vearey, who's the former Western Cape head of detectives. Thank you so much for your time this evening. You say that a specialized firearm investigation unit is necessary. How can it help here?
I think if we deal with firearms that have grown in terms of the scale of illegality that we have now, the scale of its use in incidents by organized crime gangs, and by general crime as that matter. It certainly calls, at least at the scale level, for a dedicated focus on it. And given that the Minister of Police's report on firearms control management in South Africa of 2016 highlighted that the loss of firearms from civilians and state institutions is the most significant source of illegal firearms in South Africa. I think that level of recognition, in addition to the scale of crime involving firearms, requires definitely some dedicated responsibility, investigative responsibility, and attempts to retrieve those firearms that have not been a success story when it comes to depending on mere roadblocks and clamp-down operations in the hope that criminals would have these firearms on them when we got that. And even where there are such seizures, they are insignificant in compared to the scale of those losses and the firearms out there. And I think that is one. And the fact that we getting increasingly our firearms smuggled from across the borders is also a cause concern. But I think perhaps the most significant lesson has been the Operation Impi investigation that my office was involved in with General Jacobs at Crime Intelligence at that time and several detectives. For a 5-year period, we looked into the leakage of firearms, and we found an organized criminal syndicate within the South African Police Service. We arrested some of these people together with their civilian counterparts. And the first seizure is significant because we found in Manenberg with one gang, the Outlivings, we found one light machine gun, which is a military weapon, similar to a Bren gun. We found an AK-47 that is a spillover of a hand-in from the conflict in KZN in the 90s and was supposed to be destroyed, like the military firearm too. And we also found a Z88 police pistol that was earmarked for destruction. And significantly, even just a week following, 2 weeks later, we found in one single seizure in one place 10, in the same gang, 10 Z88 pistols that were police pistols that were supposed to be destroyed at some point. And if we look at the trial that it involved with Colonel Prinsloo, he explained that although we found about 900 and something firearms back, he had spread thousands to the Western Cape, and they still continue to kill. He spread it to the Eastern Cape, to KZN long before the Western Cape was exploited as a market. So these firearms continue to kill. And unless there's a dedicated attempt to retrieve them urgently, for every crime that is committed with that firearm, the police, in whose custody it was, is civilly and criminally ultimately liable.
Do you think that this could also solve, having this dedicated unit could also help solve the mystery around some of the firearms that we've seen being stolen in police stations here in Gauteng, for example? I mean, the Norwood police station earlier this year, and also we saw one Ekurhuleni police station also being hit. Could it also help solve where some of these weapons are?
Yes, it may, but I think the Norwood and the other state police stations are firearms in what we call the SAP 13 stores, the evidence stores. These are not the firearms that I've been talking about earlier, that came from seizures and that were earmarked for destruction and from the big handings quite a few years ago, about 10 years ago. So, and these are not firearms from the military environment, but mostly in the SAP. And that environment in itself, it's more than just one or two stations. Those investigations, people went on all over the place. All stations in the Western Cape, everywhere, there's losses of firearms that are lost to criminals. Apart from the corruption, the licensing of firearms to gangsters, which is also another source of proliferation of firearms at an unprecedented scale from before. And all of these things, looking at the organized crime part, looking at the constant flow of firearms to syndicates and to feed cumulated crime, requires, we are at the stage where it cannot be left to a single police station or a small capability that exists in the walks, because they cannot handle the scale that is required. We need the type of dedicated detective resources supported by crime intelligence that are not crime intelligence on its own, because they cannot give evidence in court. It's only detectives who can take you to court and ultimately put you in jail. No other capability in the police, not visible policing, not intelligence on its own. They can at least be of assistance in a supportive role. So there's a need to grow these detectives, to grow that capacity. And it doesn't require hundreds of years of experience. When we tackled Operation INPI, when I was project manager for that operation, an operation license with a falsification of licenses, the majority of the detectives, we had experienced hands like myself inspecting dockets, guiding operations, ensuring that evidence is collected properly and that we build the broader conspiracy cases better. But most of the people who did the work were young detectives. They didn't have 10, 15 years experience. So even the whole thing of saying, okay, we're going to need very, very old, experienced people. We need them to guide. We need people like ourselves to lead. But really, detective work at its most basic level can be done by any trained detective, no matter how young they are.
Pardon me for coming in there, because you're talking about something very critical, detectives, and we've seen in some, reports how burdened they are when they've got so many dockets and they're not even able to, investigate them properly, given the number of them that are in the country right now. How can then that, be dealt with to get to a point where you say they need to be upskilled up to that particular level where they need to get to?
I don't think it's a question of skills. Investigating, doing a firearm investigation is not rocket science. Okay? You apply the same basics that you apply to investigating any crime. And this myth that you need super capabilities for super related crimes, it's quite a myth, for super detectives for that matter. It might be the stuff that Netflix movies are made of, but it's not reality out there. What you need is the basic capability to investigate crime, to understand how to build a case systematically, a piece of evidence by piece of evidence, and grow it to the point under the guidance of good commanders who understand the way a case is built to the level where a case is prosecutorially ready to be tabled both to the National Prosecuting Authority, and even better if you have that guidance from the NPA and prosecutors earlier along during the stage of the investigation, like we did with Operation Impi and Project License in that particular cases, and we were able to break those syndicates over a period of time. Yeah, so yeah, that's I think is the solution, but you need more IMPs, you need more of those project-approached investigation, because these things do not materialize to you on a crime scene. You know, most of us, when you look at detectives, we're used to seeing people standing in front of a dead body or going to a housebreaking where you actually have a scene that is the origin of the crime. Firearms smuggling is a process-oriented crime. It doesn't have a physical scene. And it requires you to correlate multiple cases in order to determine the exact evidential linkages and work them until you are ready for a broader conspiracy case or organized crime case or a racketeering case for that matter.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I wish we had more time to talk about this. It's quite an important, discussion, but let's speak again in future. Thank you so much for coming through. That was Jeremy Vearey, former Western Cape head of detectives. A very, important conversation to have, especially when he touches on the skills that are required and saying it's not work of super detectives. So interesting conversation there.